Today we have a panel discussion of the failure of Prop 412. If you're not familiar with that, Tucson's Proposition 412, which is basically the franchise agreement for the next 25 years between TEP and the city of Tucson and, of course, the ratepayers of the city of Tucson. And as you probably know at this point, that proposition was on the ballot about, 2 weeks ago, and it failed. The voters rejected it by about a 10% margin. If I could have Ojas and Tanish and Steve, if you're all here, go ahead and raise your hands using the reactions button. It's all right. So we're all here. I'm going to just go ahead and let you all introduce yourselves briefly, just a sentence or two about who you are and what your expertise around 412 and energy issues might be. So let's start out with our elected representative, who most people are going to know, Steve Kozachik.
Yeah, Steve Kozachik, Ward 6 City Council member, was active in the conversation about undergrounding in the run-up to the election, and then subsequent to that took a position in opposition to propose the proposition.
And next, let's go with Ojas. Please unmute yourself, Ojas, and introduce yourself briefly.
Hi everyone, I'm Ojas. I'm with the Arizona Youth Climate Coalition and you as eDivest. I'm working in this space for about a year. I started last summer, and I've been working with Prop 412 stuff since the day I heard about it a couple months ago. I've been going to every single public meeting there is, working with a bunch of other people in the Tucson Climate Coalition, going to mayor and council meetings and speaking about it and everything. So I've been very involved in this process throughout.
Thanks, Ojas. Tanish, introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, like Ojas, I'm a member of the Arizona Youth Climate Coalition. So we have over 50 members across the state in most major cities. And so I'm the outreach director and I do a lot of work there. And I've been working with Ojas for the past few months talking about 4112, especially the Tucson Climate Coalition. Oh, sorry about that.
No problems. So let's start out with maybe the process that led to the creation of the Prop 412 language. And the problems that you might have seen with that process that led to it. Let's start with Steve.
Okay, this issue was generating, continues to generate quite a bit of heat in the community. In fact, just as recently as a half an hour ago, somebody walked in my door and dropped off that is essentially telling me I'm misrepresented positions and all that. I mean, there's a lot of pissed off people about this. So let me walk through the process and clarify some misinformation floating around. The franchise agreement is not due until 2026. TEP continues to be the utility. They will continue to be the utility. But what brought this to the election so quickly was about 2 or 3 years ago, TEP identified a legitimate need to upgrade some of their transmission lines. And to do that, they were going to triangulate 3 subs. One of them is out by I-10 and Grant Road. One of them is down on the southwest side. And the third one is by University Banner Hospital. The challenge became that as they were identifying the proposed routes, and they were going through a series of public outreach meetings to identify those routes, one of them is running up Keno and Campbell Avenue. Keno and Campbell Avenue is identified in the city code as a gateway ordinance. That has been in place for longer than their current franchise agreement. So they're not grandfathered in, so they can't just simply ignore the gateway ordinance. One of the provisions of the gateway ordinance is that any new utilities need to be undergrounded. So we went through a pretty extensive process with them to identify a new process. It's not a process. We went through quite a series of meetings with TEP, public hearings, and eventually wound up rolling in undergrounding of utilities to what's called our special exception process. And so a special exception process is used when not just a utility, but anybody wants to achieve a variance from one of our codes. And in this case, the purpose is that if you look at the entire route of DeMoss Petrie, that's the transmission line project, there are of that transmission line project, which are absolutely legitimate arguments for going above ground with their transmission line. I'll give you an example. The Union Pacific Railroad tracks over the overpass on Keno. Why would we tell them that they need to go under the railroad tracks in what is already the industrial area? So what we did is that we put into place a process by which TEP could come to the community. It would begin with a neighborhood meeting. It would then be followed by a zoning examiner public hearing and a zoning examiner recommendation, and then a public hearing in front of the mayor and council to request a variance from the undergrounding requirement on the gateway corridor. All that happened before Prop 4 was even on the radar screen. It's still in place. And so the letter I got from the lady this morning saying that I just turned on the neighborhood and all the other stuff she says in the letter is simply false. TEP will still have to go through that special exception process if they want to require variance from the undergrounding requirement on our gateway or scenic corridors. That is still very important to me because I do not believe that the gateway corridor that's running down Campbell Avenue by the university and by Sam Hughes and Jefferson Park, that we should be allowing those 10-foot transmission line poles.
Quick question, Steve. They already passed through the exception process in order to do this 412, but they have to do it again if we're on the next election?
The special exception process is a completely separate process that they have to go through respective of Prop 412. Prop 412 was simply, do we want to extend their franchise agreement? And I'm going to get into that in a second. The special exception process and continues to be in place. So if TEP wants to go above ground on Campbell by Banner University Hospital, they still have to go through that special exception. None of that has changed. The other thing to remember, and there a false narrative was floating around in the run up to Prop 412, is that all 412 was an attempt by some of the more well-to-do neighborhoods in town, Reed Hughes, to get the poorer areas of town to subsidize their undergrounding. The reality is that we have gateway and scenic corridors running all through the city and largely around the perimeter of the city. Mission Road, Houghton Road, so we have gateway and scenic corridor that circumscribe the city and run laterally through the city. Anytime, and TEP is going to be doing more upgrades in the day, weeks, and years ahead. And so anytime they touch one of those corridors, they will have to go through the special exception process. What Prop 412 attempted to do was identify a funding source for what wound up being the undergrounding. So now I'm going to segue into Prop 412. Prop 412 is a 25-year extension of the current franchise agreement. In the normal course of business, a franchise agreement is really vanilla ice cream. Are we going to give the franchise the ability to work in our public rights of way for 25 years? Normally, they're just, check the box, boom, move on. In this case, what we did is that we rolled it through the franchise agreement an extra fee, 0.75%, which would have generated $5 or $6 million. Annually, and dedicated 90% of that for the first 10 years to undergrounding, and then 10% to resiliency things. Tanish and Ojas and some of the people who have written op-eds, and me, who've written op-eds in opposition, were saying that if we are going to sign an agreement with the utility for a quarter of a century, that's a generation, and we need to see a more articulable, measurable commitment, not letters of intent, not statements of good intention, that we can bind them to for more than 10% for the next decade of climate resiliency things that we all want. So the question comes up as, why did I support putting it on the ballot? TEP paid for all of the election costs, and they paid $800,000 or $900,000 for it. It wasn't free for them. They were in a hurry to get this to the ballot 4 times in a calendar year when we can put something on a ballot. By we, I mean the city council. March, May, August, and November. We voted at TEP's request to put this on the May ballot as a special election because they wanted to, and I'm not being critical of them, they wanted to begin generating funds because they want to start this DeMoss Petrie transmission line project as quickly as possible. So they wanted this to pass so they could start cashing some of the checks on this 0.75 resiliency fee and begin that project. So I was fine putting it on the ballot, and I take exception to the notion that some of the other folks on the council have said, why, if you didn't like a proposition, you shouldn't have put it on the ballot. The reality is that putting it on the ballot and supporting the content of the proposition are 2 totally different things. We still have the special exception process in place. We still have 3 years to go. What the day after in fact, the night of the election, when it failed, when it was clear it was going to fail, I reached out to TEP and I said, I would be happy to facilitate immediately or whenever you would like with the community, not with city staff, but with the community, because ultimately you will need the community's support to get this to pass.
Yeah.
And those meetings would be twofold. Number one, let's sanitize the franchise agreement, get the resiliency fee. This is simply about working in the public rights of way. But what we need to have is an identifiable piece of paper, not a letter of intent, integrated resource plan that is a very good.
If I could interrupt for just a second, let's hold off on what the process or the content should be until a little bit later. I'd like to get the impressions of Tanish and Ojas about the lead up and the process that led to the 412 being, negotiated and put on the ballot. If you guys could, either one of you would like to weigh in on that.
Yeah, sure. So from our perspective, we basically, it was quiet, like kind of what I talked about in my op-ed was that the city had shown a commitment to climate action in the months before. They've been working on the climate action plan. They passed like the EV readiness code, and they were doing good stuff. And all of a sudden, like the news breaks about the franchise agreement, and there was like no warning of it. It was only Steve Kozachik's office that put it in their newsletter. No other ward office talked about it, and they announced that there's actually Steve Kozachik mentioned it in a newsletter like a week or 2 before, saying that this is coming up and I want to try to get some solar stuff in there. And then 2 weeks later, they announced, oh, we're having a Q&A session tomorrow at 6 p.m. at the TP headquarters. Less than 24 hours before it was going to happen, they're like, oh, it's happening tomorrow. Be there, be a square, like good luck. And it wasn't even an input session. It was just, you go there and you ask questions. Like you have no say in what it is. And then I went to that session and like I asked some questions and like a lot of people came in person and on Zoom, and then they didn't, take into account anything we said because it wasn't an input session. And then the next week, it was approved unanimously by mayor and council to be sent to the ballots.
So from your perspective, basically public input was shut out from the process. Yeah.
And the only climate concessions were Dahl's 10% per year thing. So from our perspective, it was like it came out of nowhere and it just blew past us. And we learned later in Nikki Lee's op-ed that they'd been working on this for secret in 18 months. And it was at a breakfast meeting with Dahl that we learned that at the end of these 18 months, it's only the very ending that we even started talking about funding the climate action plan with the extra fee. So this just came out of nowhere and went super fast, and we had no chance to speak from our perspective.
Well, to be fair, they probably just didn't announce it. It wasn't secret per se. It just, they weren't telling anybody and they didn't invite anybody.
Right, yeah.
So Tanish, do you have any additional perspective on that from your end?
I mean, yeah, I think me and Ojas are on the same page here for sure. We've been working together throughout this process. And I think it's important to note that giving the city credit where it's due, they have valued the youth, they valued climate organizations, nonprofits throughout the creation of the climate action and adaptation plan. We were stakeholders. We really did feel heard, valued, seen throughout that entire process. And there was so many opportunities for the public to speak and give their input over years. So it's not characteristic of the city of the way the public lead up to 4112 was conducted. That's not the way city has done things in the past when it comes to these climate issues. And that's why it's also surprising and just particularly an issue. This isn't something we expected from the city. We've been valued in the past. It's just this one issue where we're being shut out.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that basically during the resiliency plan process, you felt very heard. You felt you were a stakeholder. The public input was heard. But during the negotiation of this franchise agreement, basically it came out of the blue from your perspective. Absolutely. All right. Let's talk a little bit about maybe why it failed. I was actually surprised. I thought, all the weight of the advertising, all the weight of TEP, all the recommendations from the city and elected officials here in Pima County to pass it was, gonna carry the day. And I was really surprised that not only did it fail, it failed by 10 points, which is, that's a smackdown basically. So I'd like to hear any perspectives about, what you're hearing in the community and maybe why you think it failed. Let's lead off with Tanish.
Yeah, I think it's important definitely to note that the perspective that me and Ojas are coming at it with, kind of this climate, this environmental perspective, that TEP needs to do more to help out with the climate adaptation plan. That's not necessarily the reason that people voted against it, right? I mean, there's a simple fact of you have a fee, right? Your rates are going up. That's a major reason for some people to vote against it. I know there was also some grassroots sort of conservative opposition that's essentially saying that this plan is, a liberal it's a liberal grab. It's the idea that TP is going to do too much for the climate, or that, it's going to create these other ideas that Mayor and Council wants, like the 15-minute city, that those are getting thrown in here just to kind of confuse people. So I think there's a variety of reasons it failed, right? I don't know the exact statistical breakdown. I think somebody asked about that in the chat about, how many people voted against it because they didn't think it did enough for the climate. How many people voted against it because they thought, they're coming at it from a conservative perspective, and how many people voted against it just because my rates are going up, I don't care what the rest of it is, right? And so all of those are issues that the next franchise agreement needs to grapple with, because it's not a singular reason for having failed.
Any insight, Ojas?
I agree with Tanish. From my perspective, I see three large blocks that kind of came together to let this down. One is the Republicans who put up all the No 1412 signs. The second is the climate community, who all voted against it for climate reasons. And the third is people who didn't know what it was. All they saw is they saw a ballot in the mail. They saw their rates going up, and they voted no, because they're like, they don't know what this does. All they see is a yes or no to them paying more. Obviously, they're going to vote no.
Yeah.
And I think of those, like, if any future franchise agreement is going to have climate action in there, then we can, forget about trying to get votes of the Republicans.
Yeah.
But what's important is getting the people who voted no because of like the $1 raising rates, actually explaining to them, either if we raise rates again in the next franchise agreement, explaining to them what that money would do and how it would benefit them, or like, yeah. So basically, like, actually, or even if we don't do that, actually explaining to them what this franchise agreement is, and why they should vote yes and not just blind vote no. Because in this current election, the like info pamphlet they got was just the text of the franchise agreement. There weren't any pros, there weren't any cons, there weren't any simple explanations. They had no idea what they're looking at. And so actually explaining what it is to voters, to undecided voters, is going to be really important in the next election.
Yeah. Any insights from you, Steve? I'm especially interested in the turnout in this election. Its unusual timing would indicate to me that it was a very low turnout. Do you have a perspective on that, and maybe why people were voting against it in such?
Well, I think that these two guys just identified several some people were going to vote against it because it was the liberal city council trying to cram down a phony climate issue, and all that conspiracy theory crap. So that cohort is not going to be brought into a yes, as long as we have climate items included in a franchise agreement. Another issue is the timing was bad for TEP. They were just approved an increase in rates, roughly $10 a month for the next 12 months to bill costs. They still have a 12% increase in front of the Corporation Commission. So the timing was bad for them. I think the optics of what they sent out, their mailer, nobody's going to sit and read a 28-page contract that has a bunch of definitions and things. And normally when you get an election package, very clear statements. This is what it will do. This is what it won't do, pro con. So when people, I believe, have a tendency, if I don't understand something, I'm going to say no. I think there were several factors. I want to agree with Kevin Dahl on something he said, and in the aftermath is that we tried to do too much with this. And that's where I was heading before when I say when this goes back, and it will go back to the vote, it needs to be sanitized. It needs to be not resiliency fees. And we need to understand also that when not just these two guys, but other members of the environmental community are saying we need to load up the franchise agreement with climate resiliency requirements, that's not what a franchise agreement is intended to do. It is very simply to allow the utility to work in our public rights of way. And that's why I was saying earlier, and if you want, I'll continue now, saying what we need is and I'm calling it a sanitized franchise agreement that's simply saying, TEP, you can work in our public rights of way. However, the community has made it very clear that we want to see more measurable, articulable commitments, not statements of intent, not statements of intention in your integrated resource plan or whatever that change over time and they move and they're wonderful aspirational goals, but commitments. And that needs to be reduced to writing in a separate document, not the franchise agreement, because that'll get what they're for. And that's where I think that we made the mistake, we kind of the corporate in trying to put the resiliency fee into that agreement. And the process was rushed. TEP wanted to, get this to the ballot in May. So we threw the 0.75 in there. I think there were several problems with that, but we can resolve those going forward with a memorandum of understanding, whatever the document winds up being, but some can point to and say, look, franchise agreement, vanilla ice cream, these are where the commitments are. And that's, I think, what the direction that we need to go.
So what's the timing on a renewal of the franchise agreement? When do we expect this to start negotiating? What's the time horizon for how long it's going to take? And when might we see the next election?
So the day of the election, I reached out to TEP and offered to begin convening these community meetings. Again, sending the message that you will need the community support because the city council does not approve your franchise agreement, the community does. And so the answer was, appreciate the offer. Let the dust settle and we'll get back to you when and if. Now that wouldn't just be Steve Kozachik running these meetings. I would necessarily have certainly invite Kevin to take part in them. The mayor's office would be taking part. We can't do more than that because then we violate open meeting laws because we'd have more of a quorum, more than any. But importantly, it would be members of the community, people from the Undergrounding Coalition who were very active in this to begin with, people from the environmental community, the student groups that are on right now, the people who have a voice and a stake and an interest in climate-related issues, literally for the century. There is something else that needs to be remembered, and that is that we built into this franchise agreement an off-ramp in 10 years so that we could have pulled the plug on this 10 years and pushed them back to the bargaining table. Reality is that for the first, one of the issues that people had a concern about is that was the first 10 years, 90% of the 0.75% was going to undergrounding.
Yeah.
And I think that we need a more robust commitment. The undergrounding is important. I think that I do not subscribe to the notion that the aesthetics of the city are unimportant. And so I think that was an important part to have in this. But we also have to build up the whole climate resiliency, the EV, the solar, the decarbonization efforts in a separate agreement going forward.
Yeah, my question, and it's a bit of a technical one, is how do you get ratepayers or taxpayers to fund that undergrounding separate from the franchise agreement? Can that be done in an MOU? Would it just be general funds from the city going to that purpose? How would the funding mechanism work under that separate
The
agreement?
conversation that I have had with TEP, and I know many of the environmental groups have had, is that we see your aspirational statements, we see letters of intent, we see all of that, but you are a $200 million plus corporation. Your shareholders, your bottom line needs to be the one stepping up and helping to fund our resiliency. Don't go back to the ratepayers. You're already asking the ratepayers for 12%. You just got $10 a month or whatever the number winds up being for the next. We need to see you identifying some skin in the game, because you already got skin in the game simply for being the utility that the Corporation Commission is approving.
I see.
Like
So
the-
basically, you don't want the taxpayers or ratepayers to foot that bill.
No, I
as well.
think that would fail the same way this did. They would simply say all you did was shift the 7.5 to a different agreement, and you're still doing the same thing.
Yeah. So Tanish or Ojas, any perspective on when and how the mechanics of the next round of TEP negotiations and franchise agreement might work?
So my opinion right now is that we shouldn't rush at all. We should take our time, and we shouldn't worry about when the next election is going to be. We have 3 years of time, and if we set a deadline, then that means we're going to be rushing to figure something out before the deadline. And rushing that process is what got us to failing this franchise agreement. Something like a partnership agreement, like a side agreement that we can bind TEP to make them to extract concessions from them. That sounds amazing to me, and that's something that I would like to see, and that's something that maybe we could have figured out if we hadn't rushed this process. So I don't think we should be rushing this. I feel like the city should, the mayor and council should, as a whole, commit to the next franchise agreement, including some kind of a side agreement, and they should tell TEP that we're not going to move, we're not going to approve the next franchise agreement until you also commit to a side agreement with actual climate provisions.
I see. So well, let me make one clarification, and that is that you said we have 3 years. Basically, you're saying you're pointing out that the TEP franchise agreement doesn't end until 2026. So there's no huge rush to get a new franchise agreement in place. But second, you're saying that the mayor and council should commit to basically holding an election hostage until some sort of side agreement is reached, and not put it on the ballot until TEP has followed through on that.
Yeah, I think the city needs to flex its muscle a bit more. They can't just give in to TEP. The city, I mean, it has to, like, if it gives into TEP, if it just lets them hold the election whenever they want, then we're never going to get some real climate stuff out of it, and TEP will be endangering the future of Tucson citizens. And if the city just digs in its heels, and if the council is united in demanding climate provisions from TEP, I see no other option for them but to, commit to that.
Yeah, that's some good political hardball insight from Ojas there. Tanish, do you have anything you want to highlight there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think definitely it's important that the council can't just hide behind on the next franchise agreement, just say, oh, well, we're going to send it to the voters. You know what I mean? The voters need to decide. No, they do have the ability to, and they should, like you said, hold the election until we have, a definitive parallel agreement. And I do like, the idea of a parallel agreement, because as I just saw in the chat, and it's been said throughout this process, by kind of muddling the issues of undergrounding of the franchise agreement of climate, you can kind of greenwash the undergrounding in the franchise agreement, right? Even if the current climate concessions are very, very minimal, by talking about climate, by talking about the resilience fee, you're creating the impression that TEP has a much larger financial commitment to climate and fighting climate in Tucson than it currently does. So a parallel agreement wouldn't let them hide behind these words, and wouldn't let them greenwash the agreement as much, because it's a completely separate document that's about the climate, right? And I think that's really important because DEP is forced to negotiate on climate as an individual issue instead of muddling them and, getting them confused.
Excellent
So
point. Yeah. So one of the reasons why I was so excited to have our two guest panelists, Tanish and Ojas, is because they're young, and we have we're looking at a 25-year commitment in this franchise agreement, and that's a good chunk of these gentlemen's working lives. Do you guys have any perspective on whether you think that a 25-year agreement is appropriate, and is there any possibility we can make that renewal process less time, so 5, 10-year, 15 agreement instead of a 20 or 25-year agreement, so that we have time to adjust and make course changes over the next couple of decades that we're probably going to need to, because we're facing very rapid environmental change here in southern Arizona. You guys have any perspective on that?
Yeah, I think 25 years is way too long. And the first off ramp, as Kozachik described it, being at 10 years, I think is also way too far into the process. We have the IPCC has said repeatedly, we have 7 more years to have all of our carbon emissions. We have until 2030, and 10 years is going to be 2033. Like, we need to see a massive shift in how we get our energy, both locally with DEP and nationally across the entire country and the whole world in these next 10 years. And a 25-year long agreement with the first chance to sit down again being at the end of 10 years is way too long. In my opinion, the next franchise agreement should be much shorter of a term. It should end at 10 years and maybe have renegotiation at 5 years, maybe even like 2 points in the next 10 years. But I think that the duration needs to be much shorter, because the state of energy is changing rapidly in this country, and we can't tie ourselves to a quarter century agreement, as you described it.
Excellent point. Steve, do you have any perspective on whether or not a shorter franchise agreement is a possibility? I mean, is there any legal impediment to sending the voters something shorter term?
Yeah, we can set the franchise duration for whatever we want, but my sense is that, well, 2 things. Number one, if we sanitize the agreement and simply call it, this is your ability to work in our public rights of way, there's nothing wrong with giving them that ability for the next quarter century. I'm not concerned about that. And that's really what a franchise agreement ought to be. As long as we have the corollary separate agreement that identifies the commitments they're going to make using their dollars in terms of resiliency and all the things that we all want. So I'm not bothered by the timing, as long as we bifurcate the commitments. One is go ahead and dig in a republic right away for the next 25 years, but this is what we want you to do in a separate agreement. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is that they have some assurance from the standpoint is they're not coming out of pocket for all the capital investments that they're making in these undergrounding or over. This is expensive stuff. And so, to the extent that they need to go and carry debt on this, they can't carry a 2-year debt piece on something that's going to be multi-millions of dollars. They need the ability to go to a lending institution and say we're going to fill for something, and it needs to be 10, 12, 15, 20 years, or they're never going to be able to make up their payments.
Yeah, I get that. What do you think about the point that Ojas made earlier, that one of the strongest negotiation points, I guess, that the city has is whether or not they're going to put that franchise agreement on the ballot, and if the MOU or whatever side agreement that we make needs to be adjusted, in the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, having that shorter agreement would give us the negotiating power to renegotiate that MOU going forward if we need to make adjustments. Do you have a perspective on that?
So I have a couple of things. First of all, we did have the 10-year off ramp in this one.
Mm-hmm.
But secondly, I've begun that conversation with TEP, saying let's meet with the community. Let's set up this separate MOU, separate whatever the agreement will be called. Something other than a letter of intent, something that they're committed to. But here's another reality that we got to keep in mind, is that in Arizona, right, everybody knows the character of our state legislature. Everybody knows the character of the Arizona Corporation Commission. And we can push them so far before they decide they're tired of screwing around with the city of Tucson, and they're going to pivot and they're going to start working on preemptive legislation up in Phoenix.
Yeah.
So we want to, as hard as we can, within the reality of the political constraints that this state has presented us. I mean, everybody on this call knows that we have legislation up in Phoenix on gun control, on zoning issues, on all sorts of things. And the last thing we want to do is to dig our heels in such an intransigent manner that they feel their only out is to go and get some legislation passed in Phoenix. Now we're fighting a completely different battle. So we're trying to thread a needle here.
Yeah, it's a good point. But again, we have another shot to change that calculus in 24. We could have a Democratic legislature. We could have a Democratic corporation commission. It's hard to know. One thing that I'd like to talk about is community rate paying, community solar, and the base rate for solar generation in the community. Is that something that we can address in a side agreement? Is that something that needs to be done at the corporation commission? Do you guys have any perspective on that? Let's start out with Tanish.
So I think, the issue is definitely important. I personally don't know exactly where the legislation for that has to come from. So I'd be happy to hear from Councilmember Kozachik to understand that more.
Any additional insight there, Ojas?
Same from Tanish.
Yeah. Okay, Steve, take it away.
Well, are you talking about the aggregate choice?
Well, yeah, I think so, but I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with that term. What I've heard is community solar, the base rate for TEP to credit people who are generating solar in their homes or businesses. That's the focus that I'd like to look at, because I was kind of disappointed that we didn't see anything in the franchise agreement. But as I understand it, we can't impose that kind of thing in the franchise agreement. That has to go through the Arizona Corporation Commission.
Right, and that's the concern right now. Community choice requires change in state statute, and in fact in the state constitution, for us to be able to implement. What we do not need approval from the state to do is something that, in fact, tomorrow I'm bringing to the city council as a study session item. And that is for us to set up our own microgrids of solar. And using what I'm proposing is we've got the North transit line that runs from North Miracle Mile out to the airport. It's about 15 miles long. And I am proposing that we put up a series of arrays of solar panels that we offer DC power to proximal businesses, and it'd be covered walkways, covered bikeways. We don't need anybody's approval for that, because we're not tying into the TEP grid, where we can then generate our own power. We can sell it to adjacent businesses. We can build affordable housing and use DC power in the homes. We're already powering LED and computer and appliances in homes with DC power. And now we're talking about making walking and biking and these public rights of way more enjoyable. You've got the shading. The city will need federal funding for this. We can't obviously come out of pocket for the full project, but that's something that would then, once community aggregate choice becomes allowable under state law, that could be an option for the people who want to allocate that to point to and say, we'll use that power. We ought to be having microgrids all over the city. I know Trace English is on this call. He's been very active in investing that we need to make sure that we have a reliable water supply when and if we have brownouts. He's absolutely right about that. 50% of the electricity that we pay, electric costs we pay to TEP go for pumping water. If we were setting microgrids up around our water pumping, we might then be able to pull some of those off of the TEP grid. So that's the direction I wanted to see the council go starting tomorrow, and I'm hoping that we'll get approval and move forward with that.
You can always count on Steve Kozachik for an interesting take and a fresh perspective and policy innovation. Thank you, Steve. We have about 15 minutes left in this presentation. So I'd like to open the floor for questions. Joe, do you have anything from any of the chat room that we'd like to address with our panel?
Yeah, this has been the most robust chat room that I've ever seen, and folks have been sharing ideas, sharing links, and of course, asking questions. First question from Paula. In normal circumstances, not under renewal of the franchise, if the gateway ordinance requires undergrounding in some part of town, who normally would pay for the work, TEP or ratepayers, or the city or the neighborhood?
Ultimately, it would be ratepayers. That's who pays for everything that your TEP does. And so, that's the short answer.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily an additional fee for the undergrounding. It's just, part of what TEP does with the money that they generate from their.
But if TEP were on this call, I want to be totally fair for them. They will tell you that we TEP are not an undergrounding corporation. Everything that we do through the Corporation Commission goes above ground. So when we threw the gateway scenic route them, they say we don't do that. And so they were sort of back on their heels. And I'm going to give John Schwartz is on the call. I'm going to give him high marks for actually flagging that requirement.
Okay, what about a side agreement that obligates?
Hold up a second, Joe. I think
Okay.
I think he wants to add.
Real quick, a comment of that. The city statute that requires undergrounding doesn't specify any way of how it should be funded. And to my knowledge, this is the first time that statute is coming into play. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, yeah. So there is no currently defined way of how undergrounding would be paid for. And that's another issue I think that needs to be figured out, is you have to figure out a sustainable solution to how you would underground these poles in the future. Because right now, like, this issue came up and then it got pushed into like a once in 25-year agreement to figure out a way how to fund this. But we're going to have to underground stuff in the future as well. And we won't always have a franchise agreement waiting for us to put that into. So we need to figure out a better way of how we can fund undergrounding in the future.
Anything to add?
Well, and so I would argue that that undergrounding requirement didn't just sneak up on TEP. It's been in since before they had this franchise agreement, and one would expect them to consider that as a cost of doing business in this community.
Yeah, and that is reflected by the fact that they're asking for a pretty steep rate increase at the Corporation Commission, I would imagine. Anything to add there, Tanish?
Right. And so, like I just said, we're not always going to have the leverage of this franchise agreement every single time undergrounding has to happen in the next 25 years. And I think that's something other people have talked about with the parallel agreement too. Right now, the city has the leverage of, hey, we have to renew this franchise agreement so we can have all these parallel things, these parallel discussions, with the franchise agreement being the city's main negotiating point. But we're not always going to have that moving forward. Yeah. So we need to plan for the next decades. We're not going to, the negotiating terms are going to be much more favorable for TEP when the franchise agreement is passed. So 10 years from now, TEP is going to hold way more negotiating power than us.
Yes, yeah, that's true. Joe, any
What
further
I'm
questions?
hearing is both Ojas and Tanish agreeing with my notion of of sanitizing the franchise agreement, and let's have a separate document that we can point to and start negotiating that. I think that our franchise agreement should be absolutely uncontroversial.
Yeah.
You want to dig in the right of way, get your shovel out. Boom, done. Here's a piece of paper is what we need to identify with them.
Good point.
And you know what? They've got Tucson in their name. Tucson Electric Power. Tucson is a community. If they want to tout the fact that they are the utility provider for this community, unless and until we can get these microgrids and other agreements going on, then absolutely. But reflect the values of this community and how in your commitments, not through the integrated resource plan, not through letters of intent, but through actual killable funded commitments.
Excellent points. Joe,
Okay, what about a side agreement that would obligate TEP to take really significant steps to mitigate, prevent climate change?
That's what we're talking about.
Okay. Okay, we've got 13 new messages. So Don't any historic neighborhoods have their property tax rates nearly cut in half? Maybe those neighborhoods could afford a slight increase in their taxes.
So the cost of undergrounding is significant. We have never done a municipal tax imposition on say a 1 square mile area to fund utilities to go undergrounding or anything. It would be an absolutely confiscatory tax that a neighborhood would have to self-impose. The city can't impose that on them. That there's a process by which a neighbor go through and agree to self-impose that tax. I would also suggest that one of the false narratives about this whole undergrounding thing, where it was the poor town are subsidizing a relatively well-to-do neighborhood, is that the university and Banner Hospital are significant users of the electricity, and they were a significant reason that TEP needs to upgrade the capacity in that area. You didn't Banner step up to the plate and say, hey, we'll ante up some cash. You didn't see Bobby Robbins step up to the plate and say, hey, we'll ante up some cash. It all pivoted around to Sam Hughes. You got to pay for it. And I'm sorry, but that's just bullshit.
Yeah. One of the pushbacks I received on my opinion on the thing when I suggested that it was a wealthy neighborhood asking for a subsidy was that, a lot of the neighborhoods north of there, up the corridor, towards the foothills, are not wealthy neighborhoods necessarily. There's a lot of, working people and, fixed income people living in those areas. And so it wasn't necessarily, just benefiting a wealthy neighborhood. Any more?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
TEP's most recent estimate was 45 million extra cost for installing 2 miles of transmission line underground. Can anyone afford that versus other pressing city needs?
There have been multiple conversations that occurred before and since 412 went to the ballot, challenging those cost estimates. Those were TEP's estimates. I would also say that anytime you're talking about underground, the cost of that is completely a function of the surrounding built environment. Are you building an undergrounding next to residential properties, commercial properties? What are the other factors? Another factor that's not discussed in about that number is, what are you doing to people's property values? And if you're going to put up a 115-foot transmission line, the degradation in property values might subject to litigation. Are you backing that out from your cost estimate as well? So anytime TEP came to the table and said, this is what it's going to cost us to put into undergrounding, there was an immediate reaction saying, let's talk about other means of doing that. Let's talk about the diminution of property value. Let's talk about whether or not that's a real number. And so I know that since the vote, there have been conversations about other ways of doing undergrounding. Frankly, done, I believe, in Salt Lake and areas like outside of the Tucson area. That one of the members of the environment community has reached out to the university and asked if they'd like to engage in this. So the number is TEP's number. It may be legit, but it doesn't include those others.
Okay, are there alternate routes available for the proposed transmission lines that don't use the Gateway Corridor? Euclid?
TEP made several proposals of routes that they would consider before the preferred route that was identified. That's the Keno Campbell one. We voted unanimously to reject the Euclid route because of its impact on surrounding neighborhoods, and probably 8 or 10, picking the number out of the air, but I think that's about right. 8 or 10 different neighborhoods, registered neighborhoods, that would be severely impacted by running it up Euclid, because then they would have to snake it right through the middle of neighborhoods as well.
Yeah.
TEP filed for a zoning request change to get the zoning variance to get the substation at Banner UMC approved all prior to the 412 vote conversation. The zoning examiner correctly denied the zoning request. And his reasoning was that you haven't even gotten a route identified. How can I, as a zoning examiner, approve a request for a variance until I know what the downstream impacts are going to be? I think that's exactly the conversation that would happen again, is that this examiner, any kind of a variance request would say, what are you doing, 3/4 of a mile away from here to people's property values and their homes and the aesthetics and the view sheds? And that would all be a part of that whole conversation. It's not a slam dunk that they can simply move a block to the east or west and blow and go.
I was just privately commenting to Andrea Kennedy that if you can recall Sandra Kennedy from the ACC, what she said when she was on here, and what she basically said that don't trust them. And she was telling the two youngsters that want to run as clean on the ACC next time, don't trust them. TEP might not be so bad as the people, as the utilities in Maricopa County, but don't trust them. Do everything you can to check them out, and they're for the stockholders and themselves. They aren't going to really help us.
Yeah. that's
So
perfect.
I would recommend that everybody look up the program that DGT had that featured Sandra Kennedy and the other two, whoever else was on that program. I think Tovar might have been there. And the
Tovar
two, a
canceled at the
couple
last
people
minute,
that
but yeah,
were,
that's available at the dgt.org. And yeah, that was a good discussion.
can you put that in the chat? Or is that too much trouble right now?
No, it's fine. I can do that.
Or tell everybody how to do that.
Susie, you have a question too?
Yeah, I'm asking a question for Barbara Warren. I understand, sorry, undergrounding's purpose for safety or for aesthetics? What is the purpose? What is the reason for going underground?
Anybody want to take that?
As far as I know, it's for aesthetics. It doesn't make a huge difference in safety. But also, as Kozachik mentioned, when you go above ground, and you might be like messing with property values, and so that might be another reason to go underground.
There's also a reliability component. How many times during the monsoons do we see power blown over?
Yeah, good point. Yeah, or a car crashing into it or what have you. Rick Rappaport, you have a question? No, go ahead.
Yes. I guess this is for Commissioner Kozachik. So what do you think the city's leverage possibly could be? Everybody wants to have climate mitigation commitments, but TEP is sitting there thinking, why do we have to put any money in if the city doesn't sign the franchise agreement? They're going to face one of two things. Either the ACC will make the agreement enforceable, they'll just push it on the city, or there might be state preemption. So what leverage does the city have to negotiate anything?
Well, that's the reason I said, Rick, that we're threading a bit of a need, but I think that the eye in that needle is fairly large right now for a couple of reasons. Number one, TEP has on their own website their integrated plan, which is a very robust statement of aspirational statements as to their intentions. And so as now we're trying to pull some far right-wing MAGA group into believing in climate change, is we're getting a utility who has already expressed the reality that we climate issue to the table. That's one thing. Secondly, without a franchise agreement, anytime they work in our public way without a permit, it's going to slow them down. It's going to be more costly. It's going to impact their ability to adequately service their customers. So they need, if it's TEP, to have a franchise agreement as well, so that they can streamline their operations. Anytime they want to go and start digging in the right of way, they don't have to go back and ask for a new permission. So that's sort of the dance that's going on. And I agree with the notion that we're not in a sprint on this. However, I would also point out that I do believe that their need to upgrade their process along the DeMoss Petrie triangulation area is real. And so to the extent that we can get them a means by which to do that sooner rather than later, I think the entire community benefit.
Hi, I was just wondering if any other power companies have received an RFP, and would TEP have any competition?
Franchise agreement is non-exclusive, explicitly non-exclusive. Anyone can come in and try and get into the market. I would suggest to you that the barriers to entry are significant because they require such an immense investment to walk in the door. You don't just come in and flip a switch and say, I'm going to provide you your power.
Sure, I appreciate that, but have there been any other companies in the area that have indicated interest in servicing Tucson?
There are small utility providers in the area, but nobody near the scope of the magnitude of TEP.
True.
And I would like to start chipping away at that, and with this microgrid idea, and frankly, to the extent that we can start setting those up around town, reduces the stress on TEP to have to expand their own or increase their own capacity, because we're now taking demand off of their grid. I just think there's a no lose in that idea, and I hope it has some legs.
Oh, good.
Andrea, you had a question?
Hi, thank you, and thank you all for coming. I was confused. Tanish and Ojas made reference to something being secret. I wonder how they found out about the process, and I'm going to cheat and ask a second question. Any chance the city could take back the electric power company like it was in the olden days? I thank you.
So the 18 months number, I learned that from Nikki Lee's op-ed. She mentioned that they've been negotiating private. And the part about the climate stuff coming in at the very end, after Prop 412 went to the ballot, Kevin Dahl hosted some breakfast meetings with people from the climate community. And in one of the meetings, they brought in the city attorney, and they brought in some people from TP, and they told us more about the process. And it's in those meetings that I learned that climate was like an afterthought in this franchise agreement. And your second question regarding like if the city could take away TP's right to operate.
I didn't hear
You're
you.
suggesting that we take over the company.
Yeah.
I also held a public meeting with TEP representatives and representatives environmental community before this went to the ballot. There was a fairly lengthy process by which TEP was meeting with city staff, the city manager, to try and craft this agreement. And so, but there was not a robust series of outreach, the kind that I'm suggesting right now. As far as taking over the franchise is concerned, that would require the city to value and buy the TEP investments. We're not going to do that. I mean, that's just a huge number.
Billions.
However, we can set up our own ability to provide power through these microgrids I'm discussing that do not affect their grid, and again, take some of the stress off of their grid. My 1 o'clock just walked in. If there's one more question for me, I'll take it before I have to jump. And if not, then I'm going to bail out on you.
Russell Lowe's, why don't you unmute yourself and ask your question?
What I wanted to ask Steve, and others, are you aware that when TEP says they're 25% solar and wind or renewables total, they're talking about capacity, which is basically a deception. If you look at their at the recent SEC report that they put out, it's called the 10K Securities and Exchange Commission report. You can look at their output, and it's 13.8% for 2022. And if you look at their planned output, if you use the same ratio essentially for 2035, instead of 70%, they would actually be putting out 39%. And so they're using this as a deception to get the public to believe that they're actually, 25 now and 70% later. But in reality, it's that isn't what is important. What's important is how much energy is delivered. And those figures are 13.8 and 39%.
Interesting. I wasn't aware of that. Steve?
So, yeah, because I've read your emails and your op-ed, I understand that. I would say, so in my closing piece anyway, TEP has written a letter of intent to the city to get city properties onto 100% renewables by 2030 or as soon as possible. That off ramp to me, or as soon as possible, is non-binding. It's not what we need in an agreement. So to Russ's point, and to the others who've mentioned this side agreement, we need to have an agreement from the utility that says this is how much power we're going to provide through renewables, not for city buildings. We've got that with the off ramp, but we've got that letter. I'm talking about the rest of the community. That's who TEP serves. The city buildings are less than 10% of their draw, and half of that is water sites. So it's the broader community conversation that we need to have. And I am maybe naively, but I am hopeful that TEP will, the fact that they just lost by 10 points. This community wants them to step up to the plate and make a much more robust commitment through a separate agreement that we can all point to and say, this is a good commitment. So vote yes on the franchise agreement because this is in place as well on a parallel path. That's what I'm hoping. And we'll see how it goes.
I want to thank our panelists for coming today. We're going to sign off Steve. So if Ojas and Tanish can stay around for a bit and ask additional questions, that'd be appreciated. But this is the end of the official program. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And thank you, panelists, for sharing your insights.
Thanks, Michael, and all the rest of you. Tanish, Josh, I've got to jump.
All right. Bye-bye. Beryl, you had an additional question you wanted to ask? Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
It's more of a curiosity question.
Mhm.
What would happen if TEP just left? What happens to the infrastructure and who would end up owning it? And because I've heard people saying, let's have a separate thing, but who actually owns all of those poles and etc.? And if TEP stopped, what would happen with that?
Well, let's assume that they went bankrupt tomorrow. Those assets would be sold off in the private market.
Hmm.
So, yeah, that's my understanding is, I mean, it's property of the corporation. If the corporation stopped existing for some reason, there would be a unwinding process and they'd be sold.
So in
That's
essence,
true.
they own the poles that they put in,
Yeah.
Mhm.
even though it's on city property.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's what the
Okay.
franchise agreement is all about. The franchise agreement is to let them operate within the city.
That's Russell.
Okay, thank you.
Russell, I'm putting you up on the panel here since you decided to answer that question. You get put in the spotlight. Anybody else have any additional questions, or are there any additional questions from the chat, Joe?
I would like to make a statement saying, I hope you young men are entering the political field because we need the kind of minds that you have to help all of us as we fight all of these problems. So thank you so much for your input here today.
Russell, you had something you want to say? You have your hand up?
Yeah, other thing was, I don't know whether Steve was referring to what's called an SEU or a sustainable energy utility, but that is basically separate from TEP, and Tucson could actually require that anybody that wants to set up energy or encourage, either require or encourage, anybody who wants to set up a business in Tucson has to basically tap into a microgrid, which is what Steve was talking about a little bit. But with an SEU, there are a couple in the United States right now in the East, and Ann Arbor is studying whether to do an SEU or not. that Tucson could do an SEU or a sustainable energy utility. And then they could basically just start taking over more and more of the energy needs for Tucson independently on a separate grid from TEP.
Interesting. Tanish, I saw you nodding along there. Did you have something you wanted to add to that?
No, I think I definitely agree with Russell there. And then another thing I just kind of wanted to add, in reference to some of the things Councilmember Kozachik said, a lot of the action that we really want to take long-term is preempted by the state, right? It's not an issue for the city to even be able to consider. And you talked about at the start needing to flip the state legislature. And I think that's such a big deal because, I mean, at the end of the day, we do, even as environmental activists, even though we have disagreements with the way the city went about this process and the way the council kind of brought it to the election, we overwhelmingly align with the council when it comes to climate action. They really are on our side, and they're prohibited from taking a lot of the action we want them to do, regarding CCE, especially by the state. And that's where a lot of our efforts are normally shifted. It's just this one issue where we've, talked more with the city one-on-one and had more disagreements.
All right. Any additional closing statements from either of our panelists?
I would say, if possible, contact your council member, especially if it's not Kozachik or Dahl, and tell them that you want to see the next franchise agreement include strong climate concessions, either in the franchise agreement or in the form of a side agreement, and tell them that they shouldn't give TEP the election and they shouldn't budge to TEP's requests until they're able to commit TEP to a strong side agreement. Please email them and tell them so that they know that the public wants.
Repeat the two forms that we should ask. Could you repeat the two forms? One, I didn't hear the second. There's the side agreement and the other form of request to the city council. It went by so fast.
Basically, like ask them to not grant TEP in an election, and ask them to make it very clear to TEP that any new version of the franchise agreement has to include concrete climate concessions. That may be in the form of a side agreement, or that may be in some other form. But tell them to not budge until they can commit TEP to climate action.
Yeah, they should at least be telling ratepayers and city users the same thing they're telling the SEC, as Russell pointed out. Very good points. All right, so I see we're about 15 minutes over, so I'm going to close out this meeting now. I want to thank everybody for coming and joining our discussion. Have a good evening, everybody.